Hi everybody, good afternoon and welcome back. My name is Liz Mosley and I'm an editor and partner here at Tortoise. If you've just joined us, this is the Tortoise Health Summit, and you've missed the part where we've sorted out the funding model of the NHS, finding a cure for Alzheimer's, fixing inequalities, and now we're going to sort out mental health. We've got 45 minutes to do that, which should be plenty of time. I'm being slightly facetious, of course, because we've had actually throughout almost all of the sessions this morning contributions that have referenced the mental health problems that we're facing. I mean, it's not just in this country, but particularly in this country, that have deepened and worsened through the last sort of 12 months or so as a consequence of the pandemic and loneliness and isolation and grief and financial pressures and combination of all of these things and more. As always, if you would like to join in, I would love for you to do that. My colleague Luke is marshalling the chat. So weigh in with personal stories. I'd particularly love to hear from people who have examples of best practice, things that they know that is working, things that have been new or different, that have changed. Would be wonderful to hear. I've tried to sort of broadly break this conversation down into 3 chunks. They're not exhaustive by any stretch, but I want to talk about the self-help element of it and the things that we can do to support and look after one another outside of the sort of healthcare system. I want to talk specifically about the mental health and well-being of medical staff and the people who are there to look after us. Particularly this year, I think we've all become a lot more aware of if the people who are the caregivers aren't okay, then none of the rest of us stand a chance either. And I think that's a really important lens to this. And also, I'd like to have a bit of a go at the sort of employer-employee relationship. And in that sort of framing of our lives, for those of us that work, what can be done there to try and draw down some practical things, places to start, learnings and things that we can take forward and look at in our reporting. So to set us going, I'd like to, if I can, start with Dame Claire Gerarda, who has joined us. I heard you on the radio this morning, Dame Claire, so you're having a busy media day. Thank you very much for making the time. Dame Claire is chair of Doctors in Distress and former chairperson of the Royal College of GPs. Now, I sort of said a little bit in my introduction, Dame Claire, that this obviously, the mental well-being of medical practitioners, the doctors and nurses are there to look after us, isn't okay, then the rest of us don't stand a chance physically or mentally. And obviously with the work that you do, particularly with Doctors in Distress and other things, NHS practitioner care, you have a really good eye line on how that is going. And I'd love to know, it's this sort of short question really, but may have a sort of very wide-ranging answer, which is, do you feel that you have the resources that you need over the next, let's say, 12 months or so to look after the mental well-being of those people, of the doctors and nurses who are there to look after us? Because I can only imagine that they're not okay right now.
Yes, thank you. And I was actually listening to the previous session, which I thought was fascinating, and I think builds onto this. Let me just set things in perspective. I run 2 services, Practitioner Health and Doctors in Distress. And Practitioner Health was set up about 14 years ago following the suicide of a young psychiatrist who, before she killed herself, also sadly killed her baby. Now, doctors traditionally have very poor access to healthcare for all sorts of reasons, which I haven't got time to go into. But pre-pandemic, the health and well-being of the workforce was not good. The NHS was not a good employer. We were seeing unbelievably high rates of bullying, burnout, depression, early retirement, you name it. We saw it. And paradoxically, during the first lockdown, actually the mental health of the workforce went up. It improved, except for certain groups such as GPs, peripatetic doctors and people trained overseas. And what I say resonates with nurses as well. But overall, for those that worked in hospitals, it actually improved. Because what was being provided is what we've been lobbying for years, which is care. I mean, let's just put it into a single care. Somebody to look after you, somebody to address your well-being, somebody to pull you out if you're looking tired, somebody to give you a hot meal. Doctors and nurses before wouldn't even have a hook to hang their coat, let alone a place to sit down. So we saw an improvement. But what we're seeing now, and there was a study just recently published from the Royal College of Physicians that said that 25% of doctors have accessed mental health services since the pandemic, but much more so since, I would say, September. In my service, we're seeing 120 new referrals a week compared to 60 new referrals per week before. Now, these are doctors, we can put labels on them, depression, anxiety, we can call it moral injury, we can call it PTSD, you can call it what you want. But actually what we're seeing, and it's replicated amongst nurses as well, is serious distress, serious fatigue, to the point that I was on a call just before this talking about suicides, and we're seeing people who are facing such unbearable conditions on the wards, and I'd also say in general practice, that all they can do is go home and cry and talk about death. So, and this is, I think, people listening to this, especially if you're healthcare staff, or even if you're in some of the other frontline, will understand what I'm talking about. So you're saying, is there enough services? Well, the good thing, if anything, out of this plague that's come out, is the focus on well-being and mental health in the workforce. Prior to the pandemic, people were making a noise about it, and people like Paul, who doing fabulous work, but really there wasn't the resources going in. There was all of something must be done, but not the resources to follow. What's happening now is something is being done. So NHS England, for example, are directing resources towards resilience hubs. They put on a series of services for all NHS staff. My service, practitioner health, is open for any health and care, any health staff in the NHS in England, and there's a similar service just about to be set up in Scotland. And what we provide is mental health care for depression, anxiety, all forms of therapies that you care to talk about. And we wrap our arms and open our heart to our patients. It's not about medicalizing and sending somebody off for talking therapies. It's about opening your heart up and actually allowing people to talk and for you to listen with an open heart. Of course, other things need to be done. We need to be addressing some of the underlying causes, not just the pandemic, by the way, but the intensity of the workload and how we actually deal with staff in the workplace. My other charity, Doctors in Distress, actually is there because what we need to be doing, and if you say, have we got enough resource? No, I think we need to be providing every single health and care worker with a space to talk about the emotional impact of their work in a confidential, safe space so that it can both talk about what they're doing and give support and get support, but also give support to others. So just finally, am I optimistic about the future? I think so bad now is the mental health of the workforce in all sorts of parameters. I mean, we're really robust and resilient. I hate that word, but you'll understand what I mean. Resilient individuals, of which the medical profession are the most resilient individuals I know, are falling over. And as I said, are literally falling over and weeping and whatever. But actually, services now are being directed towards them. And actually, people are well aware that we need to deal with the underlying causes, albeit we're in a pandemic at the moment. When we leave the pandemic, we must not go back to how it was before, which is where the health and care workforce were largely unattended, but yet they were meant to give their entirety to the patients that they serve. So I'll leave it at that. Sorry for the long answer, but I know it's an introduction.
It was excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Claire. And I think in and amongst that, there are some germs of very useful, I think, insight for other employers too. This sense that in the beginning of the pandemic, the sort of easing of some of the requirements on medical staff to do performance reviews and administration and these sorts of things, as well as just creating spaces for them to go and sit down, take a breath, have a cup of tea that weren't there before. These are things that can be usefully lifted and shifted to other kinds of working environments as well. A follow-up question before I come to Bryony, if I can, Claire, which is, after a trauma, or if you've been a period of mental ill health, people need sort of time and space to get better. From lots of the things that we've been hearing today about, of course, we've got COVID to deal with, but after COVID, there's not going to be a sort of dip in requirement for people to be seen by various people in the NHS. There's lots more to come, things that have been postponed, deferred, etc. The demand is still going to be there, although it may change shape. How are medical teams going to be able to get that time and space? Because it's not like suddenly there'll be a gap. It's just going to stay intense.
Okay, Liz, the last thing that goes with doctors, and I would say the same thing as with nurses, the last thing to go is work. So doctors will continue to work literally till something catastrophic happens, not to do with patient safety. So, for example, many of my patients will present after a serious drink drive offence, or will present having had a near miss on the motorway, which was actually a suicide attempt. Or sadly, some people presenting, well, they can't present, but the first note that they're unwell is suicide. So the last thing to go is work. They will continue work, and the Hippocratic Oath tells us, make the patient your first concern. The same goes to nurses. So what I think, and it's very simplistic, I think even before we end the pandemic, I think we need to be mandating breaks, mandating annual leave.
Yeah.
At the moment, of course, you can't go anywhere, and we have invented the word staycation. I think we should mandate. Now, we can't take 2-week blocks as everybody used to do, but I think we should be mandating 2 to 3 days at a time and actually taking people's laptops away, or at least just putting free access to social media or Netflix or whatever. Sorry if that's an advert. But actually, I think we should be doing that, because I think it's so serious now is the fatigue, and people are saying this, that we cannot continue. If I have got people, and this is also senior managers, this isn't just the doctors, and so bad are we right across the board in health and care to admit that we might not be invincible, that I think we now need to be, we have mandatory training, let's have mandatory holidays.
Yeah, it's a very good idea. Thank you very much, Claire. I'm going to come, if I can now, to Bryony Gordon, who many of you will know from her exceedingly wonderful podcast, Mad World, but also her many books about, and you've written and spoken a lot, Bryony, about your own struggles with your mental health and ill health and what have you. And I wanted to ask you a question which has troubled me a sort of fair amount this year, really, which is, I do think it is true to say, as Claire says, that this year there has been a lot more talk and awareness of people's well-being or otherwise, largely triggered by the fact that we're aware at how many more people are struggling this year than were before. So it's sort of a good news story and sort of not a good news story. But my question is all that awareness, broad awareness, do you think, does it really make it any easier for people to come forward on the day that you feel terrible and say, I really don't think I can do it today? Because there's a sort of, on the day when you feel okay, it's quite easy to say, oh, yes, we all talk about this stuff all the time now. It's not so stigmatized, it's not taboo. But when you feel awful, it's much harder to do that.
I think it's incredibly important that the conversations are had, but I don't think the conversations in themselves are the end point. I think that there's lots of sort of assumption that because high profile people are talking about mental health, because the media are talking about mental health, because we're doing summits on mental health and we're doing conversations like this, that it's okay. And the truth is that there was a crisis in mental health services long before this pandemic came along. So the awful situation that we've heard about in the news recently, and that we had at the beginning of the pandemic, which was the situation of triage, which was doctors having to choose who they would give care to. But essentially, and Paul and Claire, I may be talking out of turn here, but I don't think I am, is that in mental health services, that's sort of been that's a norm. That happens all the time. And so for me, the key thing is you have to have the conversation, but there also needs to be places for people to turn to speak to, because actually it is really important, as Claire said, and that you were there to wrap your arms around someone and not just send them off for talking therapies. There needs to be love and support and empathy and all the rest of it. But there does need to be proper provision. And I don't think there is, and I especially feel at the moment, we're in this situation of lockdown. I've seen a lot of sort of lockdown skeptics have weaponized mental health in a way as a call to not have lockdowns. Yeah. And I would argue that actually actually what we need to be calling for is not an end to lockdowns, but an increase in public awareness of what is available for people. So we know, for example, in the first lockdown that NHS trusts, I think each trust came up with an emergency mental health crisis line. People don't know that you can self-refer online for things like IAPT services, which are improving access to psychological therapies. So that's your talking therapies. There isn't, I just feel like there isn't enough. I'm not really answering your question, I'm sure, but there isn't enough knowledge. I think in the way that it's knitted into our DNA, what to do if we become physically ill. If my daughter has a fever for several days, I know I need to take her. Well, in normal circumstances, I would take her to A&E or a doctor. But we don't really know what to do when we are experiencing that day you speak of, where you don't know if you can get through the next hour, let alone the next day.
Yeah. Bryony, do you, there was some talk in the session before that I wanted to pick up with you. Some resistance, I guess, to the idea of self-help, self-monitoring or something. People's awareness of their own mental health or otherwise, as the same way as you use the example with your daughter. Your daughter is poorly, has got a fever, get the Calpol out, take her to see somebody. But, it's not as easy always to monitor somebody's mental ill health or otherwise. And self-help has been a big part of sort of a more modern way of thinking about mental health and what we must be in nature, and we must eat healthily, and these things that we know we have to do and we know it makes a difference. But it's a bit of a double-edged sword that people were talking in the chat before this session, that there's the sort of to push the onus back onto the person might not be the most helpful thing if somebody really is, having a very difficult time with their own mental health. You don't shrug your shoulders and go, have an apple and go for a walk kind of thing.
Well, I do think there's a lot of, I certainly know, and I don't know if this resonates with anyone, but my experience of when I've been in mental health crisis, people have said, have you tried meditation or mindfulness? And meditation and mindfulness and going for a walk in nature, these are all fantastic things. I don't want to do them down. And they're also fantastic things to maintain wellness. But when you are in crisis and in mental illness, you do need more than that. So I think that there's a real difference between mental illness and that sort of that perhaps larger conversation of mental well-being, and how looking at a tree will bring down your heart rate and drinking a green juice is really good for you. I think there's a lot of woolly advice in terms of mental health out there that, sort of, I guess, the Instagram vacation, that's not a word, I've just completely made that up, of mental health. And it's like physical health, there's a million different kind of strands to it. But I do think those kind of real frontline services that the emergency care, the knowing what to do, the discussions about suicidal thoughts, and Claire referenced doctors having to go home and all they can think about is death, and I want to shout from the rooftops about, for example, organizations like the Maytree Respite Centre, which they run a house and they will take you in for 5 nights if you are suicidal, and they want to, if they could get more funding, they could have more of these. There's so much. I think it's really important that we don't sort of say, oh, this conversation about mental health is, it's important we have it and we don't kind of poo-poo it, because if we don't have it, we can't get to the other things that are needed, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And that centre, it sounds extraordinary. I hadn't heard of it. Thanks, Bryony. I will come back to you shortly. I'm going to go now to Paul. There's lots of interesting people in the chat. I'd love to talk to Rosaline Quinn if I can. Dr. Fran has been making some important points about being valued. Katie Malburn as well. Would be great to hear from you shortly. But if I can go to Paul, we've chatted on the thinking before, Paul. It's lovely to see you again. How are you doing today?
My mental health is all right, thank you, Liz.
Okay, good. I think we'll take all right. That's a reasonable benchmark to be at. I feel like I'm at the same level. Paul, I wanted to ask you, we've just been talking with Bryony about the difference between maintaining wellness, mental wellness, go for a walk in nature, eat well, try and sleep, and those things which are important, and then when you're mentally unwell, those two things are very different. And obviously being mentally unwell is also a spectrum. You can be in crisis or you can be struggling and lots of things. ordinary people like me, it's not easy for us, either with somebody in my team, somebody in my family, a friend. It's not easy for me to know where somebody is on that spectrum. At Mind, your chief executive of it's a huge mental health charity, and you have access to lots of research and insight and resources and help and everything else. In terms of the sort of how do you spot somebody who's going from one place to another, and then where can you go, to Bryony's point about making it easy to know what to do next? I think some of that stuff in the middle is where the pinch points.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a really interesting conversation, because in a way what we have is, we think about, if you like, since being three different spaces. So you've got the thriving, and that's where, doing things that are good for your mental health, that's where you can kind of engage with a lot of those sort of more positive things. Then you've got the conversation we're having already about the people who are unwell, who need clinical help and support. And then in the middle, you have a very large number of people who at any one time are struggling. And it's that struggling group who have, you've lost some of your protective factors for your mental health, the things that are good for your mental health, like the ability to hug your grandchild or take part in team sport, or your risk factors are really escalating. And I think that's one of the things that we're seeing from what Claire was talking about with NHS staff, because their job control is really disappearing. They're working right at the boundaries of their ability. Or your risk factors are increasing because you've got financial pressures or relationship issues. So you're in that struggling space. So what do you do in that struggling space? So the first thing is that you as an individual can spot signs of things that you're going to be doing differently from the way that you usually behave. So that might be about your own diet, your way you exercise, your mood, the way you think about yourself, those kinds of feelings. Actually, really interrogating some of your thought processes and your feelings. And really, this is where friends, family, trusted people, work colleagues come in, because the chances are that they will also be spotting you being a little bit different, a little bit behaving slightly differently. Maybe not being quite so social, maybe not necessarily really engaging with people around you, or in a work context, maybe your productivity not being quite what it is. And that's the space to intervene with quite a simple and straightforward conversation. And it's the equivalent of what Claire was talking about of care. It's that conversation where you're physically, sort of metaphorically wrapping an arm around somebody and saying, "Are you okay?" Really meaning it, asking how somebody is. Mm-hmm. And at the end of that conversation, if you're really worried about somebody, encouraging them to then seek help, because people still feel, and Brian, is that sorry, people still feel quite reluctant to seek help, either when you're in that moment, because you feel you're a burden to other people. You don't feel as though you're worthy of accessing services. We found this a lot in the first lockdown, and way before this, but in the first lockdown, a lot of people stopped accessing services because they didn't feel they wanted to be a burden on the NHS. And the consequences of that was, of course, that ultimately a lot of people just got a lot worse and needed more intense support. And that's why we've got some of the major, quite significant problems we've got in terms of mental health services at the moment. So, so I think there are very clear, simple things that we can do. And we're not over medicalizing it at this stage, but there are steps that people can walk down, or people describe it as a well that you fall into, or steps that you slowly walk down, and then suddenly you get to a point where you realize that you need extra help and support from a professional. And
it's almost like I'm imagining, sorry to interrupt, Paul, when you go to the doctor and you're sitting in the doctor's waiting room, and there's a poster on the wall that says, if it's this, go to Boots. If it's this, call the GP. If it's this, go to A&E. And we sort of as adults, we instinctively know what those things are, but there's a poster there that just reminds you. It's almost like an equivalent thing for mental health would be a sort of useful thing for everybody to just have learned about, to simplify it and take the sting out of it, because as you say, the existing system as it is very complicated. I'd like to go, if I can, I'm going to come back to Claire Gerarda in a second. Paul Dinsdale's asked a good and important question to you, Claire, in the chat. But let's go to Rosalind Quinn, if we can, and a couple of others from the room. Rosaline, are you there? I can see you haven't got your camera on, but maybe you're not don't want to come on. That's okay.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Hi there. Oh, that's okay. Rosaline, I was interested in a comment you made earlier in the chat about this idea of a layer of lifestyle coaches. Would you just sort of talk through what this is?
Well, it's just I'm not in the healthcare service at all. I know very little about it, but I am aware that all of us need. I started a walking regime with a friend. It's much easier to do those things if you have a buddy to do them with. And I realize a lot of people come home from hospital after maybe a minor operation and don't really pick themselves up and recover. If they have a family member to help them out, fine, but often they don't. And if you trained up a layer of young people, the kind of people who often do caring for older people, but you train them up as a lifestyle person, so they turn up, they are your lifestyle buddy. They help you walk, they take you out for lunch, and they get exercise into your day, because exercise helps everybody. Exercise and good nutrition. You're sort of retraining people how to live when they've become paralyzed by the depression. Maybe the depression's following illness or following an accident, something like that, or it's another form, but helping you to take those steps, not in a medical intervention, but in a lifestyle intervention. Not for everybody, but I think it could help a lot of people.
Thanks, Rosaline. It's interesting, and it sort of talks a little bit to, in a sort of layperson sense, to this comment that Paul Dintel's made about sort of massively scaling up a training program to enable people to be able to access proper counsellors, therapists, and what have you. Bearing in mind, upskilling is a big topic of conversation. What is everybody going to be doing? There's a lot of people out of work and so on. It's employment. Maybe a lens of that too. Thanks so much for your contribution, Katie Malbon. I can see you there as well. If we can, hiya, Katie. How are you?
Hi, good, thanks.
And you are a doctor. You are a GP.
Yeah. No, yes. I'm actually a paediatrician.
Okay, all right. So I was interested in you made a couple of comments. You were talking about a twice weekly psychotherapy something. Tell us what you were doing and how it helped.
Well, I mean, I think one of the important things to say is, we should not be just waiting for the crises to happen, but we need to be intervening before that. And I think, certainly, thinking particularly about nurses who are working 12-hour shifts, who, don't have the time necessarily to access the support that they need, or don't feel that they need it. They're the ones that we kind of need to be targeting, who are facing, particularly, during the pandemic, really difficult situations, and actually providing something that's a sort of routine that's there every week that they can access. So during the first surge, we did a twice weekly psychotherapy group, which was nurses could come in, drop into just for an hour, twice a week. We tried to ensure that all nurses got a chance to do that by sort of covering their shifts. And some were quite reluctant to go, but did go, and actually, have said in retrospect how much it really sort of preserved their mental health and made them much better able to cope with this second surge. So we're now putting it into place at the moment. And these are actually, the situation is they're paediatric nurses and paediatricians who are now looking after adults who are dying. So it's, they're seeing pretty awful stuff every day, and going home to, either living on their own or having to then cope with families at home. So they absolutely need some kind of mental health support, but I think it's important that we provide it there for them.
Thank you very much, Katie. I'm going to come back to Claire if I can. You just posted a particular thing in the chat, Claire, about doctors in distress believe that group work is the most important therapeutic response. Would you just unpack a little bit? Why is that? Why does group work better?
Well, group, and this is for those people, because I think if you've got a serious mental illness, you need to have a bespoke, and you probably might need individual, etc. But what Kate was just describing, bringing people together, either in their own groups of belonging. So Kate described paediatricians and paediatric nurses come together. So that's their group of belonging, or in wider groups. So, for example, Schwartz rounds bring people together in groups around a whole ward. Allows people to share what they're going through in its simplest way. They allow people to gain therapeutic or support from the group, but also to give support. And it also mirrors your behaviour. So, for example, you might see somebody very anxious, in the group, you might see somebody tearful, and actually what you're actually seeing is yourself. So you can comment on the person in the group, but actually reflect back, and somebody will reflect back to you and say, well, that's actually how I'm feeling. So as an intervention, and it is bizarre this, that here we are in the giving profession, and we have no access to therapeutic spaces to talk about the emotional burden of our work. The only people in the health system that do are psychotherapy trainees. So unless you actively put something in place, there is nothing that we can do. And yet, if you can share some of the emotions and some of and just briefly, I run a group for those bereaved following the suicide of a doctor. And I firmly believe that had those doctors, now it's very difficult to prevent suicide, so bear with me here, but I firmly believe that some of those doctors would still be alive today if they'd had a space to normalise what they were going through. So, for example, complaints. So somebody said, oh, for God's sake, Laura, it's a complaint, let's help you with it, rather than suffer in silence. And groups also help doctors, and I would say nurses, become a patient, because doctors do not like becoming patients. They'll run 1,000,000 miles rather than put their hand up and say, hey ho. But it allows them that transition to become a patient. So I have you say what next? I would wish that the NHS, instead of having compulsory mandatory training, which takes 30 hours a year, or compulsory appraisal, actually puts in place what works, which is therapeutic spaces where we learn together and support each other.
Yeah.
Ooh. Sorry about that.
Somebody, all over some hot hammering.
I'm at work.
Hammering in approval. Thanks, Claire. It is extraordinary, actually. I sort of I'm quite aware of the fact that when you're trained to be a psychotherapist, you have to be psychotherapized yourself. But it is extraordinary that there is no other sort of mandatory requirement or provision for people in a caring profession to be looked after. Brian, I'm going to come back to you if I can. You set up Mental Health Mates, your thing, that sort of is a sort of framework for a bit like the thing that Rosalind was talking about a little bit. People can get together and do stuff as a community. Can you just tell us a bit about the background to that? How do people use it? How does it work? What does it mean?
Well, it's peer support, and it's group. I mean, it's not therapy, but it's similar. Yeah. I think group therapy is actually fantastic in so many ways for so many different, not just doctors and nurses, but so I set it up 5 years ago when I was in a very, very bad place, and we hear all this stuff about the 1 in 4 and people who experience mental health issues each year, but at the time I didn't really meet people. I have a type of obsessive compulsive disorder which can be quite dark and leave me, incredibly intrusive thoughts, and there were long periods of time as a child and as an adult that I couldn't leave the house. And I kept on hearing as well, exercise is so good for your mental health, but one of the key symptoms, I guess, of things like depression and anxiety disorders are that you don't want to leave the house. It tells you to stay inside. So I was like, well, how can I bridge that gap, and how can we create something where people can get together and meet other people like them and realize that they are not mad, or that they're not bad, and they are mad, and that's okay. So I set up Mental Health Mates, and it wasn't as formal as that. I tweeted out something, and to my, would anyone be up for a walk in Hyde Park it was Valentine's Day 2016. And to my surprise, 20 people showed up, and it's now all over the country. And what happens is people in local communities, they come to us, we give them the resources to set up their own walks in their own areas and the training to help, because it's not therapy, but we obviously know they might find themselves in situations where they are asked to deal with. But obviously at the moment we can't do the walks, but they're doing Zooms and stuff like that. But it's incredible to see how that meeting, as Claire mentioned, that hearing someone else say something, and it's hearing yourself, it's being heard. Mm-hmm. And you see people who turn up and you think if I don't give them a hug now, I mean, this obviously was pre-pandemic, they're going to run away and go home, and and then by the end of the walk they're going off for coffee with people, and it's kind of incredible. I always say the thing that all mental health issues have in common is that they isolate you, they lie to you, they work by disconnecting you from the world, and much the same culture as it's a culture of silence. It's like an abuser, and they want you to feel like a freak and that there's no one who understands what you're going through. But not only does someone understand what you're going through, there's someone out there who is going through what you're going through. And I can only speak for myself personally, but the most helpful thing in dealing with my own OCD, and I'm in recovery from alcoholism, has been peer support. It's been fellowship. It's been being able to meet other people like me and realize I have nothing to be ashamed of. I'm just a human whose brain sometimes misfires.
Thanks so much, Bryony. I think that the mental health mates is brilliant. And actually, if you want to just have a little warm feeling inside, have a look on Twitter at the mental health mates little sort of feed. That's so lovely. We're going for a walk in Roundhay Park on Saturday. Come and join us at 2 p.m. It just makes you feel really nice that people are out there doing nice things with one another in a COVID safe and secure way, obviously. Paul, I'm going to come back to you. I want to talk about sort of the language, actually. So we called this session, in our way that we do as journalists, it wasn't me, to be fair, this time, although I am definitely susceptible to this, a mental health time bomb. And it's a sort of word that's been sort of lobbed around a fair amount, and it gives a sense of urgency, and it gives a sense of scale, and but it's also sort of frightening and unpleasant. And I wondered, possibly unhelpful kind of language to talk about this, if I think about an individual who might be experiencing a mental health issue. Do you have a sense of whether, if I say we the media, I'm not talking on behalf of everybody, is there a better way that we can come at this, rather than sitting around and admiring the problem and making everybody feel desperately anxious? What's your sense?
So slowly, I think slowly but surely we've shifted from never talking about this issue of mental health to talking about it a lot more, and that's been probably a 10-year journey that we've been on as a kind of society, and all kinds of people have really helped shift that dial, so that people like you we're able to have these conversations now. I think now that we've started to have the conversation, we're beginning to understand the enormity of the problem. So, this is a really big issue that affects many, many people in our society at any one given time. Secondly, we're beginning to understand a bit more of the complexity of the problem. So, Bryony rightly says there's such a big difference between people who are, at one end of a very, very long spectrum, who may be just, in inverted commas, mildly struggling, right the way through to people experiencing really significant mental illness who need very intensive clinical help and support. So we're beginning to unpack all of that, and this is all good because we're beginning to understand this. And it's a little bit like the way in which we thought about cancer 30 years ago. Nobody talked about it. Now people are talking about it, and then people realise that there's so many different types of cancer and different ways of treatment and so on. In terms of the urgency question, is this a time bomb, a tsunami, a rising tide? Well, the reality is that mental health services were under significant pressure before COVID. There is a long-term plan to invest in mental health services, but that isn't going to be enough to be able to cope with the additional pressure that is likely to emerge over, again, it's not a sign of, it's going to happen. It's a rising tide rather than a tsunami, but it is a rising tide of increased need. And so we do need to have additional investment to be able to cope with that. And there are particular groups where I think we really need to pay some attention. So I think it's absolutely right. And people like Bryony and you and others are rightly shining a light on the mental health dimensions of the consequences of coronavirus at just the right moment, because this is probably going to be one of the most important parts of the conversation of the next year as we start to unpackage what the hell just happened. And as we start to unpackage that, and the sort of COVID tide hopefully starts to recede, we start to see the shipwrecks of people's lives, and the consequences of, for intensive care staff, the damage and the impact it's had on them, for people from Black and minority and Asian ethnic communities, the consequences on those communities, and on many of us individually, the pressure that is put under us. Now, it doesn't mean that we're going to see millions and millions of more people becoming clinically unwell, but it does mean that we're going to need to pay more attention to our mental health in order for us to make sure that we're able to cope with, with the consequences of some of this. So we do have to be a bit nuanced in this conversation, of course. Yeah. It's really important that we're nuanced in this discussion. And Claire is rightly scribbling away on the chat to help us give us even more nuance on this. But I do think it's also important that we don't lose sight of the significance of the issue, because the issue in and of itself is still, kind of blinking out of the shadows from decades of ignorance and stigma. So now we're out there, we're actually going to, the big chance for the next year, 2 years is to really grasp this issue and work out what we need to do. What should we be doing by way of mental health education for young people in schools? What should we be doing for people who are unemployed? What should we be doing for the NHS staff? What should we be doing? But also, what should we be doing for people who have faced the most serious mental health problems as well, to treat them as equal citizens? So there's a big agenda, and that's always part of the challenge here, isn't it?
Yeah, because it can feel so huge and overwhelming. And before I move on from you, Paul, I'm conscious of time. A question that may be a non-question, but it's nonetheless something that sort of pops into my mind, which is when we talk about COVID's a really good example. Actually, cancer is another one. When we talk about those things, we understand that there is a balance between prevention and cure, sort of risk mitigation and treat it, fix it. With mental health, there's definitely the same sense of look after yourself and then here's what we treat you if you're better. But I have much less of understanding or knowledge of whether we have adequate, sufficient research into understanding the conditions that we're talking about. I don't know about the science of mental health in the same way that I'm aware of, obviously this year, the science of build a vaccine, find the sort of the therapeutic treatments, and the same with cancer treatment. Do we understand why depression, how depression, in the same way as physical illnesses, if you like?
Well, we don't spend nearly as much on research as we do on mental health as we do in other clinical areas. So we don't have as deep an understanding, and we need to do a lot more. But it's probably also the case that we don't make enough of the research that we already have in terms of implementing effective approaches and others. And I'm sure Claire will want to say something about that translation of research and indeed proper investment in research. So yeah, we do have some better ideas about prevention, but we don't have a really cohesive public mental health model that we can approach in the same way as we've learned to apply a better public mental health model to issues like obesity and other areas. And I think that's going to be a really big part of this next stage. And we do have a decent understanding about what is currently available by way of treatment. But what a lot of people with mental health problems tell us is that, and indeed the research backs this up, is that not all treatment works for everybody at any one time. So the efficacy of drugs, efficacy of therapy is not universal, it's not super strong. So people often, it's really important that people are given choice about the type of treatment they need. And what we haven't yet done is made that connection to give us the right answer at the right time in the right place. And that's the next big challenge, I think, for mental health research, to really investigate how we really help people get the right thing at the right time, in terms of the appropriate level of clinical intervention. Because there is also a danger that we pathologize basic natural human emotion here, that we don't turn all of this into mental illness, that we don't, it's normal to be, it's perfectly reasonable to be feeling a bit frightened and scared at the moment. If you've lost a loved one, it's perfectly reasonable to be experiencing grief, loss and all those emotions that we feel. The thing that we just have to watch out for is when those emotions overwhelm you to such a point that the rest of your functioning is really inhibited, and that's when you might need to reach out and seek help and support from an IAP service, or from therapy, or from some other kind of form of peer support, even, as Bryony says. Those are So we just have got to be careful about how we approach this. I think we don't want to turn this into a super science.
Yeah, it's a interesting point, this idea of pathologizing normal emotions, because of course that also is where people think, oh, I'm probably just sad. It's what makes it hard to self-diagnose. It's incredibly difficult balancing act. I'm very conscious of time. We've got 1 minute left, so perhaps I'll come back to Bryony and then to Claire for a sort of final word, if you like. Bryony, your ongoing work to talk about your own experiences and to sort of and on your podcast with other people talking about theirs too. Do you have a sense, if we think about the next sort of year ahead, if you were going to sort of have a magic wand and we come back in a year's time and look back, what would be the thing that would have changed about, whether it be mental health awareness, mental health provision? What would be the thing that we would have achieved that you think would be a real win?
I think it's for me, I think it would be the kind of bridge from the awareness of mental health to knowing how to treat it, mental illness, to knowing where to go for treating. I think that we hear all the time about how bad mental health provision is, but that in itself isn't very helpful when you're in crisis. And there is a lot of mental health provision out there. And I think I would really like there to be more government campaigns, for example, right now about what people might need, what people can access when they're in lockdown, if they are feeling like they might be suffering from depression or anxiety disorders. So I think that kind of normalising the access of mental health services in the same way we understand what to do for physical health services, and the more we do that, the more as well professionals are able to, I guess, to feed up that there needs to be more funding and more provision. You know, the more people ask for the services, the more they have to provide them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you so much, Bryony. And Claire, I've just seen your point in the chat. I think we need to build back up psychotherapeutic thinking.
Just 1 minute then. I think we need to put psychotherapeutic thinking back into every single institution, health institution, not just to treat staff, because I'm not sure that's what it's about, but actually to start thinking below the presenting issue. We used to have Michael Ballant, the patient, the doctor, and their illness. What Paul was saying is absolutely right. I think we have slightly gone, we've got a lot of research about medicines, but we're not going back and thinking about emotions underneath that. So if there was one thing I wave a magic wand this time next year, every single health and care staff have access to a therapeutic group, and every single hospital has a psychotherapeutic space where we can start just learning the language and they can start interpreting it for us.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much to Paul and to Bryony, and of course to Claire for joining us today. But obviously, particularly to Claire, for all you do anyway in terms of supporting all those crucially important people. I really do hope that your ceiling doesn't fall down, because I think that's the last thing that you need. And thank you very much to everybody for joining us today. I've learned a lot in the last 45 minutes, and I've made some notes, and I think we have had some really clear and practical things that we can cling on to. And it can feel sort of quite overwhelming and spiral out of control, and then you feel hopeless and it feels like you shouldn't have bothered. But as Claire says, this access to psychotherapeutic spaces and psychotherapeutic thinking inside of hospitals and embedding it in the culture, and that thing you said earlier, Claire, about using your heart and opening your heart so that it's a love environment rather than here's a prescription or your sort of referral and off you go. I think that is really helpful. Brian has talked really eloquently about mental health mates and how much of a difference that sort of peer and just person contact can make such a difference to create an environment where you can chat about how you're doing, rightly or wrongly. I think the suggestion that Claire made at the beginning about mandating leave for doctors and nurses, particularly in the next couple of years, but hopefully forever, to make them stop working, because as you say, it's just not in their nature to just not go to work and not look after people, is really important, and such a simple thing in a way. I'm sure it will be a nightmare to implement, but such a simple thing. Awareness of that you can self-refer, the sort of the systems that exist. People aren't really understanding that what is there. I think it would seem to be a quick win, inverted commas, to make it just a little bit simpler to let people know what they can do and how they can access the existing services, albeit if there aren't many of them. And then that thing I just wondered about, the sort of communications thing, the poster on the wall of the pharmacy that could just help people to have a bit more of an instinctive sense of where they are or where their friends and family or colleagues are on that spectrum that we talked about. Thank you so much to everybody for your time and for joining us this afternoon. The next session, I think, is the final one of the day, is at 2:00. My colleague Giles Rattel, we return to our old friend, the coronavirus, COVID-19, talking about whether we can learn to live with it. Personally, I would rather not, but if that's the choice, then let's find out how. Go and have a cup of tea, get yourself a biscuit, and we'll see you back here at 2:00. Thank you so much. Bye.